Some crimes are so meticulously planned, they're designed to be forgotten. The evidence, systematically destroyed. The victims, silenced into oblivion. But sometimes, a paper trail survives. Today, we're not just looking at history, we're examining a blueprint. The blueprint of one of the largest, most organized systems of sexual slavery in modern history. We're going to piece it all together, one horrifying document at a time, using records that were never, ever meant to see the light of day.
So that's the big question, right? How do you even begin to prove something that was built to disappear? It's the exact challenge that faced Allied soldiers and investigators as they fought their way across the Pacific. They were discovering that they weren't just fighting a war, they were uncovering a meticulously organized crime, hidden in plain sight.
All right, so our investigation starts in a pretty unlikely place, the jungles of Burma, August 1944. After a brutal 78-day siege, American forces stumble upon something that would lead to the very first detailed official Allied report on Japan's comfort women system.
What they found were 20 Korean women, and their story was heartbreaking. They told their interrogators they'd been promised jobs in factories, only to be tricked and forced into sexual slavery for the Japanese army. The report that came out of this, Prisoner of War Interrogation Report number 49, well, it became the first real thread, the first piece of hard evidence that pulled back the curtain on the chillingly systematic nature of these so-called comfort stations. And that one report from Burma, it was just the tip of the iceberg. As the Allies pushed across Asia, the true scale of this thing, it was just staggering. This wasn't some isolated incident. Historians now estimate there were nearly 2,000 of these comfort stations, enslaving up to 200,000 women from Korea, China, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, you name it, a vast, state-sponsored network of abuse. So how do you go from one shocking discovery in Burma to understanding a continent-spanning system? Well, you follow the money. Or, in this case, you follow the paperwork. There was a special unit, the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, or ATIS, and they started sifting through thousands of captured Japanese documents. And what they found was the cold, bureaucratic machine behind it all. And what they found in those documents is, honestly, just chilling. This wasn't the work of a few rogue commanders. This was official military policy, laid out in black and white. These regulations read like a horribly mundane business plan, detailing everything from operating hours to fee structures. They even scheduled medical exams, not for the women's health, but to keep them functioning as military assets. Just look at this. This is a real fee structure from a station in Nanjing. It shows, in the coldest possible terms, how this was an industry. Rape, industrialized, and priced out by military rank. And the women? Oh, they never saw a single yen of this money. It all went to military paymasters, usually to pay off some made-up debt for their own food and shelter. It's just unbelievable.
But maybe the most insidious part of this whole blueprint was the language they used. This wasn't just bureaucracy, it was a weapon. They created a whole set of euphemisms to hide the crime in plain sight. Comfort facilities were rape stations. Women were classified and shipped in freight cars as military supplies. This language made it possible to obscure the truth, not just during the war, but for decades after. Documents and regulations tell you the how, but they don't show you the who. They can't show you the human cost. For that, we have to turn to a different kind of evidence. Less than a month after the discovery in Burma, Allied forces liberated another station in China, and this time a photographer was there.
An American Army photographer, Private Charles Hatfield, he takes this picture, and it changes everything. Because now this isn't just about reports and numbers. It's about these 4 women. It's about the visibly pregnant woman right there in the frame, being led to safety. This single photograph gave the crime a human face. 56. That's how many years it took. 56 years. 56 years before Park Young-sim, the pregnant woman in that iconic photograph, could finally find her voice and publicly testify about what happened to her. Even with photographic proof, she lived in silence for over half a century. And that number, 56, it really opens up the next and maybe most frustrating chapter of this story. The part where the war ends, but the suffering doesn't. The part where all the evidence, the reports, the documents, the photos, for some reason, just wasn't enough. And it raises this really troubling question, doesn't it? If a crime of this magnitude goes unpunished, If it's not prosecuted in the halls of international justice, does it even count? Did it officially happen? For the survivors, this wasn't a philosophical question. It was their reality for almost 50 years.
I mean, just look at this breakdown. It's a catastrophic failure of justice. The main Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, the big one, the equivalent of Nuremberg for the Pacific, barely a whisper about this system, one passing mention. Now, smaller Dutch courts actually did prosecute a case successfully, but for the vast, vast majority of victims, just silence. So you have to ask why? Why this total deafening silence? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was this perfect toxic storm. The Japanese government went on a campaign to destroy its own records. The Allies classified their reports, burying them in archives. The women themselves didn't fit into neat categories, not POWs, not civilians, so they were ignored. And on top of all that, you have the deep shame and stigma that prevented so many from speaking out, and new political priorities, like the Cold War, that made justice seem inconvenient. So for decades, the blueprint of the crime sat buried. But then, a voice, a single voice that broke the silence. The story wasn't resurrected by governments or academics. It was brought back to light by the survivors themselves. Their unbelievable courage is what finally validated all that evidence that had been gathering dust for decades.
Think about this for a second. Let's look at the discovery timeline. By the end of the war in 1945, the Allies knew. They had the documents, they had the photos, they had the reports from the field. The proof was overwhelming. It was all there. Now hold that in your head and look at this, the recognition timeline. That gap, that's 46 years of silence. It wasn't until Kim Hak-soon bravely stood up in 1991 and gave the first public testimony that the dam finally broke. Her courage started a chain reaction that led to more testimony, more historical discoveries, and eventually official recognition. And as more survivors felt safe enough to come forward, the data that was buried started to make more sense. You can see the sheer international scope of the system here, but you can also see a clear racial hierarchy at play. While women from many nations were victimized, the overwhelming majority were Korean and Chinese. And all this evidence, from the old documents to the new testimonies, it allowed historians to map out the entire horrifying process. The blueprint wasn't just for setting up stations, it was a life cycle of total control. From deception and coercion at the start, to being transported as human cargo, to brutal daily exploitation, and even forced abortions. The final step? Well, captured orders call it disposal, a cold word for murdering the women to make sure there were no witnesses left.
75%.
That's the estimated mortality rate, a number so high it's hard to even comprehend. 3 out of every 4 women enslaved in this system did not survive. And this wasn't just an accident of war, a result of disease or bad conditions. It was a direct consequence of a military strategy to erase the crime by eliminating the witnesses.
So that brings us back to where we started, liberation. It sounds like a single moment, right? A door gets kicked open, a war ends. But what we've seen here today is that liberation is a process. It's a long, painful journey. And for the handful of elderly survivors who are still alive, that process is still going on, which leaves all of us with a question that's still very much alive today. When does this liberation finally end?